Hello, Plaidman here. Golly gee willikers. There's so much going on. There's so much I want to talk about. So I'm gonna do a short video on this and this book, and I hope it's never a movie because God, gee golly willikers, I did not enjoy this book. All right, I want to talk about other stuff, but we're gonna talk about the elephant in the room. No. Quite the opposite. Quite the contrary, actually. We're gonna talk about the dust mite on the floor underneath the elephant's foot in the room. Yes. And so those of you who are like, I'd like something to listen to and watch. Let me, get into it. This is not that. Anyhow, so I read this book series actually, Grunt Life, and it's 3 novels. I very much enjoyed it, and I did a review about it. And in there, they referenced a lot of books that they, in the book, suggested people read. It's a complicated thing. Anyways, effectively, they're training soldiers, and part of the training procedure is like, read these books. And it was the first time I had ever had that happen. It was a very meta, very weird moment in reading, and I was like, okay, cool. So I was like taking notes on my phone, like, I'll read this, and this was one of the books, The Forever War. Now, while that is a terrific title, in a weird way, it is what it says it is. But having read a lot of science fiction, all right, start with the facts. So this book came out in 1974, so a while ago. 50 years ago. 50 years ago this book came out. Written by Joe Haldeman. And effectively, it's set in the future. Ironically, it's set in his future, was like early 90s or something like that, leading into way in the future. And I think why it was suggested in the Grunt Life book was because it delved really heavily. There was a lot of inference on armor, like outer armor, and wearing like a suit, and how to interact with that and stuff like that. But effectively what the story is about is mankind is expanding and exploring, which would be nice if we did that, though we're still stuck and we have barely gone to Mars. So whatever, guess we fail that. But mankind's expanding throughout the universe, and then we get attacked and destroyed, like one of our ships. And so we react how humans tend to react in this situation, which is like, oh, cool, you messed up with our boats, then we're just gonna kill you and attack you. And we proceed to effectively have an intergalactic war with this race that we know very little about. And it's all through the perspective of this one guy. And what's interesting, there's a couple elements of it. One is they have like a forced enlisting process. And instead of just getting like idiot grunts like with Vietnam or whatever, and I'm not trying to knock people who were enlisted in Vietnam, but instead of just like getting people or physically whatever, it was more of a controlled enlistment of people who were educated. Oftentimes they went to college and whatever and fit certain physical requirements. And those are the people they scooped up, which on the outset is interesting because I don't see the why. And frankly, the book doesn't really do a good job, other than we want people to know about these things, like the certain tech that we're using and whatever. But in my head, I'm like, but you're literally scooping a bunch of intelligence out of your society and removing them from your society. That's not going to go well for your society. But as a science fiction novel, what he wrote is what he wrote, so fine. So they try this, do this thing, and there's a high death rate. Just in the training process, there's like less than 50% of the people are actually going to live through the training process. Like live through, not just pass, no, but survive the training. And so that's a thing. And then you get, and most of their time, and here's the weird thing, is they're traveling through space, and it gets kind of complicated. They're traveling through space, and then there's the time that they're traveling for them, okay? And then there's the time for Earth, and how much time has transpired. So if you think day one, and they leave, right, it might be 5 days for them, but for Earth, it's 50 days, okay? And that general thing permeates throughout the story. It's a short story, one novel, really like kind of this big. And it's kind of an interesting, like, oh crap, because not only are you being recruited, but like your whole life on Earth is effectively gone. Like, it doesn't matter. If you were married, like, and there isn't an instance of that, but like maybe it's a disqualifier, but like if you had friends, they're gonna be, if you're lucky to come back, they're gonna be 20, 30 years older. And there is a situation where he comes back and, you know, whatever, and his mom's like kind of alive. And that was another fascinating thing, is how much society changed in, let's say, 50 years, and how socialistic it became. One of the weird things that was interesting was like medicine was based on whether you needed it. So it was total communistic, as opposed to like, oh yeah, you're unhealthy, let's give you stuff to heal yourself. It's like, no, like you're gonna die anyway, so we're not gonna give you anything. And then there's this whole black market stuff, and then you have like, oh, you can get a government job, but I don't want to work the full job, so I can like parcel out part of my hours to this person, and then they can do the job. But like, it's a further iteration, in my opinion, that whenever communism and socialism are applied, they fundamentally fail. Like, so that was an interesting, almost a subliminal messaging part of the book that I appreciated. I don't know if that's what the author intended, but I appreciated it. Then you get, there's another fascinating thing in the training where there's this, it's almost like a government dictate that like, if a dude wants to have sex with you, then you have to have sex with him in this military situation. So they have basically 50-50, 150 men, 50 women combined, and like there's a rotating who shares a bunk together, which is an interesting idea. I don't think it's a good idea. And they had weird adaptations where it's like once they get past a certain point, you get couplings where people like kind of prefer to couple. But there's still this weird thing of like, well, I want to have sex with you. And the woman's like, I don't want to, no, I'm not interested. And like, he never really talked about that. It kind of glossed over these kind of finite details. But it did bring up an interesting point of like, oh, well, what would an environment be in that scenario? And effectively, I disagreed with all of these things. Like, I don't agree with 50% of women being part of active combat. I understand 50% of women might be super intelligent enough and be needed in that scenario, but not in active combat. So, whatever. I just fundamentally disagree with pretty much everything he talked about in the entirety of the book. But anyhow, so that was an interesting concept. And that's what I love about sci-fi, is that science fiction reserves the right to like throw something at the wall and just like make you look at it and you're like, well, that's sticking right now, but it's not going to stick for very long. But it's an interesting concept. And I applaud the concept of just throw things at the wall and see if it sticks. Whatever. Anyhow, so that's one part of it. Another part is they have these suits and it's like hyper complicated and whatever. He gets very science fiction-y. Forget all that. Effectively, it boiled down to they didn't know much about the enemy, and there was like a huge usage of AI, which also they kind of gloss over. It's like this weird thing of like, yeah, and just computers do all the things and the thinking, but you also need ground pounders. But they're in like these full big suits. It's like basically a tank, a suit, and they have laser finger pointers. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. Like he built this whole world, but he like it felt hollow. Like it was there, but it was just like you didn't really explain anything, and you're spending all this time. I feel like it could have been 3 books instead of 1, but whatever. He did a good job. Then you get into like this. It's weird. Like in a way, they're almost a civilian army. How they interact with each other is very civilian, but it's in this army setting, and there's this very severe dictate of like, if you don't follow your commanding officer, you're going to be killed. Just be killed. So while they still operate and act like civilians, they are in a military structure, which is like so weird. And there's also no sense of like, I'm doing this for country or for this, because the other weird thing is you go away for 2 years, you come back, it's been 20 years. Like the time dilation is like, yeah, and your world when you come back is totally different. And there was this fascinating thing that I thought also worth mentioning, where our main character is kind of like a 70s baby, born in the 70s. And he leaves and comes back like in the 90s. So in the 90s, he leaves and comes back, early 2000s. And suddenly he gets a new squad of people and they're all gay. Like everyone's gay. Everyone, the women, the men, everyone's gay except for him. And he's now a commander and he's like, okay, fine. I'm not homophobic, but like, this is weird. And it is weird. Like, as for myself, I just felt like it was like, okay. But also, like, we're in 2024 and I'm like, society's happening. I can see how if you were to fast forward 60 years and there wasn't any stops, then yeah, a lot of people would be gay. And okay. I don't like it personally, but okay. And the main character handled it well. I thought he was interesting. What was fascinating about this book is that there's so many things brought about that were worth reading, worth listening, worth thinking about, and worth talking about. I don't agree with most of them. Fundamentally, I don't agree with women being in the military. I don't think that lesbians and gays should be a normal thing in general for society. I don't think it's conducive to continuing the population of humankind or just conducive to a good, healthy society. I think every society that has made homosexuality a normal thing, they die. They just end up falling apart. And while homosexuality is not the singular reason as to why, it is an interesting tell of like when, to the degree a society accepts homosexuality as acceptable and normal, that correlates with how quickly that society will decline. But the final bit of this book was very fascinating. There was a really interesting battle, and like one thing that I kind of weirdly didn't get, and then the battle scene happened, and I was like, oh, I get it. Is they're training with like in their suits, these very super bulky, obnoxious suits, and they're training to use like spears and swords and bow and arrows, and I didn't really understand. And it's like, oh, because in a certain stasis field, basically they go back to ground zero. They have no tech. They're in their suits, but they can't even communicate with each other. But they can use like basically very simple weapons. So training to use that works. And it was a really cool battle scene. How it was done, it's fine. And it just fascinated me how, in a weird way, that's kind of how technology works. Is it evolves to a certain point, and then you find like a key that can be like, let's go back to zero. And then you also need to train for that. And it's just fascinating. And one of my favorite worlds, if you will, is Warhammer 40k, which I haven't really talked much on this. But in a weird way, that's kind of what that world is in a nutshell. Is it progressed to this terrific level, and then it totally regressed back to kind of like basic, almost barbaric level tech with, big armor and stuff like that. So this book was almost like a harbinger or beginning or a foundation of what later the 40K universe, Warhammer 40K universe became. And it was fascinating. I enjoyed it. I think the book's worth a read. There's stuff in there that's not quite child appropriate, so I wouldn't necessarily suggest it for children. But in general, I like the book. I was happy to get through it, though, because I liked reading it. I liked that it was made, but there was so much stuff in there that I disagreed with. And the way it was written, it felt like a very slow pace, and I was just kind of ready to be over with it. So, all in all, I suggest one read it, but I didn't really love the book. So, that's it. Apply my ramble out. Love you all. Bye-bye.